Ric Flair once confessed something that would shock any fan. "I feared him. The Nature Boy, a man who swaggered into every arena as if he owned it, was secretly afraid." But who were the men that could make wrestling's most arrogant superstar so nervous? The answer is more revealing than you might think. Main script. Behind the lavish robes and the fleet of luxury cars, behind the legacy of the Four Horsemen and the 16 World Championships, Ric Flair lived with two distinct kinds of fear. One was the fear of physical harm. The other was a deeper, more shadowy dread, and both of them haunted his career. For 5 decades, Ric Flair performed as a man who feared no one. He was the 16-time world champion, the charismatic icon who declared himself the man. But that bravado was a carefully constructed performance. Internally, Flair knew the truth. He wasn't the toughest man in professional wrestling, not even close. And in an industry populated with genuine fighters, that reality could get you seriously injured, or even erase your legacy. This isn't a story about heroism. It's a story about survival. Flair's career wasn't built on pure strength. It was built on knowing who to respect, who to avoid, and who to praise so loudly that they would become his protectors, instead of his destroyers. The men on this list represent both of his fears. Some could break him with their fists. Others could break him with their influence. And Flair understood that in the wrestling business, both types of damage could be permanent. People often misunderstand the word of fear. When articles discuss wrestlers, Flair feared, they usually reference backstage politics, professional disagreements, or clashing egos. Those stories are dramatic, but they miss the point. Real fear in wrestling wasn't about who you argued with. It was about who could genuinely hurt you without facing any consequences. In the old territorial days of the National Wrestling Alliance, NWA, fear was a survival tool. The NWA protected its world champion like a valuable asset, and that champion needed enforcers, men who could step in if anyone caused real trouble, men whose reputation alone maintained order. Flair wasn't one of those men. He was a phenomenal athlete with incredible stamina, but in a real fight, Flair knew his limits, so he surrounded himself with monsters and he praised them relentlessly. That praise wasn't just respect. It was a calculated strategy. By telling everyone that Harley Race was the toughest man alive, Flair was buying his own safety. If the toughest man endorsed Flair as champion, then Flair's reign was seen as legitimate. It was a brilliant political disguise, and it worked. But it also meant Flair spent decades in the shadow of men who could end him without a second thought. As Flair's career evolved from the NWA to WCW and then to the WWF, his fears transformed. Physical toughness still mattered, but new threats emerged. Television executives, writers, and a new generation of stars hungry for his spot. The fear of being punched was replaced by the fear of being forgotten. And for a man whose entire identity was built on being the best, irrelevance was a fate worse than any beating. Therefore, when we talk about the wrestlers Flair feared most, we're really talking about two separate lists. The first comprises the old-school enforcers, the legitimate tough guys whose hands could shatter bones and whose mere presence quieted the locker room. These are the men Flair was genuinely, physically afraid of. The second list is different. These are the rivals who threatened Flair's legacy, the ones who challenged his ego, his status, and proved that even the Nature Boys could be shaken to his core. Together, these 10 men reveal the true limits of Flair's power. Let's begin with the man Flair himself called the toughest he ever encountered. Number 1, Haku. The name Haku needs no elaboration. Across the entire industry, the consensus is unanimous. He was the single toughest man in the history of the business. Flair said it, and Rao's Stone Cold's Steve Austin confirmed it. The legendary stories about Haku are the stuff of locker room lore. He laughed off pepper spray, snapped handcuffs, and injured people without apparent effort. Wrestlers used to say they'd rather shoot themselves than fight Haku, because if you fought him and lost, you'd be severely injured. But if you fought him and actually hurt him, you would be killed. That is the pure, unadulterated fear Haku inspired. It was simple and absolute. If Haku decided to hurt you, you would be hurt. Flair's relentless praise of Haku was a smart political move to stay on his good side. But it was also completely sincere. Haku represented the ultimate, uncomplicated truth that some men in wrestling could genuinely, truly destroy you. And there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. That is real fear. Number 2, Harley Race. Harley Race was the man Ric Flair owed everything to, and that is precisely what made him so terrifying. Flair consistently called Race the toughest wrestler he ever knew. Race possessed an undisputed reputation for legitimate toughness and was one of the very few men Andre the Giant was known to fear. Race's endorsement was the crucial element that made Flair's NWA World Championship reign credible. Flair respected Race completely, but that respect was fundamentally rooted in fear. Flair knew that if he ever crossed a line with Race, Race could end his career, not through political maneuvering, but with his bare fists. Flair's constant, public praise of Race was a survival tactic, but it meant he perpetually lived in Race's intimidating shadow. Number 3, Scott Steiner. Scott Steiner didn't merely disagree with Ric Flair. He actively tried to dismantle him. During the chaotic collapse of WCW, Steiner launched into unscripted hashoodle promos on live television, viciously insulting Flair's age and calling him a jealous old bastard M. Flair was incensed but powerless to stop it, as WCW's backstage structure had completely broken down. Steiner was wildly unpredictable and had zero regard for the consequences. The fear here was entirely political. Every venomous insult from Steiner was a public announcement that Flair's influence was crumbling and the business was moving on without him. Flair had no defense against a man who offered him no respect. Number 4, Bret Hart. On the surface, Bret honors the hitman. Hart and Ric Flair were both technical masters, but they embodied two different wrestling universes. Flair from the NWA's gritty territories, and Hart from the WWF's global sports entertainment stage. Hart later publicly criticized Flair's in-ring style, even going so far as to rate him a 3 out of 10. For Flair, this was a profound and deeply personal insult. It was a dismissal of everything he prided himself on. The fear Flair felt toward Hart was the fear of being exposed. Hart's matches felt spontaneous and intensely real, while Flair's often followed a familiar, beloved formula. Hart's criticism suggested that Flair was more of a charismatic performer than a pure wrestler, and that underlying truth genuinely scared him. Number 5, Mick Foley. The feud between Mick Foley and Ric Flair ignited not in the ring, but in the pages of their respective books. Foley criticized Flair's tenure as a booker in WCW. Flair retaliated by dismissing Foley as a glorified stuntman. This single insult disregarded all of Foley's insane sacrifices, the falls onto thumbtacks, the matches in barbed wire, the sheer physical torture. Their conflict was a fundamental clash of ideologies. Flair believed wrestling was an art of psychology and technical mastery. Foley believed it was about raw, visceral emotion and physical sacrifice. Flair feared what Foley represented, a new generation that succeeded by breaking all the old rules, proving that Flair's classic blueprint was not the only path to greatness. Number 6, Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff was Flair's boss during the peak of WCW's success. Bischoff represented the new, corporate side of wrestling, where television, ratings, and market share mattered, more than ring psychology or pure talent. Flair felt profoundly disrespected and deliberately sidelined. Bischoff held the power to control Flair's storylines, his television exposure, and ultimately his paycheck. The fear Flair felt wasn't about physical harm. It was about professional erasure. For a man whose life was dedicated to being axed the man, the prospect of becoming irrelevant was utterly terrifying. Their clashes were a battle for survival in an industry that was changing too rapidly for Flair's comfort. Number 7, Vince Russo. Vince Russo never laid a hand on Ric Flair, but he inflicted more pain than any wrestling move ever could. As a head writer in WCW, Russo used his creative power to systematically humiliate Flair on television. He orchestrated storylines that turned Flair's own son against him and had Flair's head shaved bald. He did it all, knowing Flair had no recourse. This represented a new species of fear for Flair. He used to fear men who could break his body. Now he feared men who could break his legacy. Russo embodied everything Flair despised about modern wrestling, prioritizing shock value over in-ring skill and destroying a legend's credibility for the sake of television ratings. The powerlessness Flair felt was a deeper, more profound fear than any physical pain. Number 8. Stan Hansen. Stan Hansen was dangerous for one simple reason: his terrible eyesight. Inside the ring, this made him a live weapon with no safety switch. His famous lariat clothesline was always devastatingly stiff, but with his impaired vision, it became a genuine hazard. Hansen didn't always pull his punches because he couldn't always see clearly enough to do so. Flair knew that every match with Hansen was a roll of the dice. The fear wasn't that Hansen was malicious. It was that he was accidentally lethal. Flair had to trust that Hansen would be careful, all while knowing that trust was fragile. Hansen forced Flair to wrestle in a state of constant low-level terror. Number 9. Wahoo McDaniel. Wahoo McDaniel was a man and a half, as Flair often described him. A former NFL linebacker, McDaniel was the definition of a legitimate tough guy. Their matches in Mid-Atlantic wrestling are legendary for being excessively bloody, brutal, and exhausting. They wrestled for an hour, regularly, because that was the minimum requirement for survival. McDaniel's chops left deep welts, and his punches were notoriously stiff. Flair had the stamina to keep pace, but just barely. Flair admitted that McDaniel pushed him to his absolute limit. The fear was as psychological as it was physical. Flair knew that if he displayed a moment of weakness, McDaniel would exploit it without mercy. So Flair praised him publicly while fearing him privately. Number 10. Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody was chaos in human form. At 6'8" and 283 pounds, Brody was an unstoppable force who played by no one's rules but his own. He was volatile, brutally violent, and utterly uncontrollable, and Flair wrestled him a staggering 75 times. Most of those matches went to a 60-minute time limit draw. This was no coincidence. When you faced Bruiser Brody, you didn't get a quick match. You endured an hour of pure punishment. Brody hit ferociously hard and expected his opponents to respond in kind. He tested Flair's limits like few others ever could. Every bout was a grueling mental and physical war, and Flair knew that if Brody ever decided to ignore the script, there was absolutely no one who could stop him. Flair would later claim that Brody helped make him famous. That's the polite public version. The raw truth is, Brody forced Flair to prove his mettle night after night. That's not just respect. That's fear disguised as gratitude. So who do you think was the most justified of Flair's fears? Was it the raw, physical terror of Haku, or the legacy-ending power of a Vince Russo? Let us know your pick in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into wrestling's untold stories, make sure to like this video and subscribe for content you won't find anywhere else. Ric Flair's career wasn't built on being the most dominant force. It was built on knowing who to be afraid of, when to be afraid, and how to survive that fear long enough to become an immortal legend.